Man, I've always wanted to conduct that. What a fun piece. So this is our All Wagner concert. I wanted to do a concert like this for a long time. We call it Gods, Ghosts, and Legends because Wagner's music has to do with supernatural, mystical, legendary things. Richard Wagner, great German composer who had distinctive levels of his compositional growth. Tonight we will be able to expose the early Wagner from the 1840s up to the late Wagner in the 1870s. Wagner was a masterful composer who masterfully wrote for the orchestra. And you'll see tonight we don't have any singers on stage because Wagner loved singers, but he loved the orchestra more. And he felt that the orchestra could tell the tale and paint the narrative without singers. And so that's why we're able to tell all these stories just with the orchestra tonight. So you're in for a real journey in the music of Richard Wagner tonight. So I'll explain a little bit about the pieces as we play them. That was obviously Ride of the Valkyries. Ride of the Valkyries, you've heard it many times before. It's the most famous piece on the concert. Ride of the Valkyries comes from the Valkyries, which is the second opera of Wagner's four-opera ring cycle that lasts 15 hours long. It's called the Ring of the Nibelungen, based on Norse fantasy tales about a ring of great power, and the ring enslaves and curses and eventually kills all those who bear the ring. And so in this story, there are gods, there are monsters, there are giants, there are dragons, everything that you can imagine in the tale. Specifically for the Ride of the Valkyries is a moment at the very end of the opera after an epic battle where the 9 Valkyrie daughters of Wotan, or Odin, who is the god of the gods, they have taken fallen heroes, lifted them up, and taken them to Valhalla, the castle of the gods. So the next piece we're going to play is also from Ring of the Nibelungen, the 15-hour opera, and this is called Siegfried's Rhine Journey. Siegfried is the hero of the story. He goes to a mountaintop and sees a lady who is in an eternal slumber surrounded by fire. And there was a prophecy that said the person who can penetrate the fire can awaken Brunhilde. Brunhilde was put to kind of death, sort of an eternal slumber, by her father Wotan because she was naughty to daddy. So he goes up there and he doesn't fear the fire. He goes through the fire on the top of this craggy mountaintop and he awakens her by kissing her. They fall in love and then they have this wonderful relationship, and she decides to gift to him the Ring of Great Power, which it had passed many hands and gone to the dragon and the giants, and finally it got to Brunhilde. Bad omen, you wear that ring, you're going to die. Remember that. So she has the ring, she gives it to Siegfried as sort of a token of her gratitude and fidelity. Then she says, you need to go out and be a hero. So go wherever on this big journey and adventure and just discover yourself and have experience in life and just go have fun. So he goes on his big journey, the Rhine journey. The Rhine is the river there. So he goes on a journey, and this tale right here is told by the orchestra. There's no singers in the opera. It starts with the, I guess, fate-like motif, this fate motif in the trombones, which represents that things are not going to end well for Siegfried. After that, the celli invoke a super long melody that represents darkness over the land. And they invoke it twice and go in different ways. And then the orchestra evokes this amazing slow buildup of the sunrise coming. And then the sun peaks over the mountains, and there's this glorious outburst of color in the orchestra. So you'll hear just slowly but surely the sun rising in the orchestra. At that point, after the outburst colorful part, we have Siegfried play his horn call, and that's played by the horn, our principal horn player. And you'll see whenever you have a horn player starting in band, probably in 6th grade, they're all playing this tune. This is the most famous little horn tune ever. It represents Siegfried's horn call, and you hear the horn call throughout the opera. After the horn call, the orchestra builds up into a crazy chromatic dance that represents both play and fire. The god of fire, Loge, has been invoked, so you have sort of play and fire simultaneously. After that, we have Wagner depict the river Rhine with the orchestra, especially the strings going and they build up, and you have sort of this sense of water moving forward, which is guarded by the Rhine maiden, who guarded the gold that was stolen in the first place and forged into the ring of great power. So this is Siegfried's Rhine journey. The last selection on our first half of the program is Rienzi Overture. Now, Rienzi is one of those early pieces, 1840, right at the beginning, sort of the early self-discovery phase of Richard Wagner. And Rienzi is not really in the opera repertory anymore. You don't see full productions of it, but you do hear the overture. The overture is quite charming. It's filled with all of the features that you would think of classic Wagner: lyricism, athletic strings, bombastic brass. But you can tell it was written 35 years previous to Siegfried's Rhine Journey. You see very clearly, sort of like the Beatles, there's like this early phase, the imitation phase, then there's the self-discovery, then mastery. Mastery phase, this sort of self-discovery phase for Wagner where he's figuring out who he is as a composer, trying to make his mark in the world. So you'll hear remnants of imitation, a little bit of Mozart, a little bit of Rossini and Italian opera, a little bit more repetitive and predictable structures, less of the adventurousness that you see in later Wagner. But nevertheless, it is fascinating music, very powerful. There's a reason why this is a staple of concert repertoire. So you hear at the beginning, you hear the trumpet make a call, and then beautiful chords come in. And then you have all these wonderful melodies, and at a moment it seems like you're doing a Rossini overture. It just seems very just joyous and buoyant and classical in that way. Rienzi is basically a tale where if you look at the characters, Rienzi's a little bit more grounded than other operas. We've been telling mythical tales and mystical happenings and legends and so forth. Rienzi is one of the more interesting overtures in Wagner's canon, and I think you'll really, really enjoy it. The story is not as potent or outstandingly legendary as some of the other ones, but I think you'll really enjoy it. So this is the Rienzi Overture by Richard Wagner. This is intermission. We have one more half to go. The first piece of our second half is the overture to The Flying Dutchman, which is the earliest Wagner opera that is still performed on stages today. It was written right after Rienzi. The Flying Dutchman is a legendary ghost ship steered by the undead, who can never make port, who are consigned to sail the seas forever. Their ghost captain, he was cursed by the gods because he invoked the name of the devil, hence being on the ocean for eternity. However, an angel appears and says, here's the token of your redemption. Once every 7 years, your ship will be led by the waves to shore. And if you find a woman who will be faithful to you, you will be released from your curse. So the undead captain goes to shore, finds a lady, she is faithful to him, and they love each other. He's released from the curse, and at the very end, they're transported into heaven. It's an amazing orchestral encapsulation of a turbulent storm at sea. We've got the strings, who represent sort of the wax and wane and just the turbulent madness of a crazy sea storm. You've got horns and trombones, which represent sort of like the powerful agent that nature is. And throughout the overture, we have a bunch of specific things that are happening. So at the beginning, we hear the horns that invoke the power of nature. The strings all the time are going very turbulent. And then we are introduced to the love theme that the ghost captain has, and that is portrayed by the English horn and the woodwinds. The craziness continues, and we continue to have this turbulent build up. In the middle section, we have sort of a silly moment, as sort of like a jovial chorus dance, where you have lightness and happiness for one of the free. When you encounter Wagner, you'll see there are brief moments of happiness. The rest of it is doom and gloom. People just like that. It's more dramatic that way, right? I think a lot of film music is inspired by Wagner. The turbulence comes back and builds, and we have this glorious theme in the brass that is a sort of a transmutation of the first C theme. And then at the very, very end, we have a little coda, a little blessing, a little small section that is played by the harp and the woodwinds and the strings that represents the eternal theme of redemption by love. All Wagner operas end with the same theme of redemption by love. And it doesn't matter how turbulent, how demonic or evil or terrible or perilous the story is, it ends with a beautiful melody. That's just how he ends and finishes and concludes his tale. And so the theme of redemption by love is this: that mankind cannot be redeemed only except by love. And so love is the theme of this, and you'll sort of hear the transportation of them into heaven. This is the overture to The Flying Dutchman. so excited to have Lydia here on harp. We've never had a student harpist play with the KSO in the 16 years I've been here. And she's never played with an orchestra before, but she submitted an audition saying, I play a little bit of harp. And I was like, yeah, you really do play harp very well. And so let's give Lydia a hand. Very nice, Lydia. We've got a smoking crowd tonight. This is exciting. So we're going to have a very different change in feeling and spirit and tone and spirituality with this next piece. It's Siegfried's Death and Funeral March. So Siegfried, the same hero who went on an epic, heroic adventure because of his loved one Brunhilde, here near the end of the 15 hours in an opera called Götterdämmerung, which translated loosely means the end of the gods, the twilight of the gods. Brunhilde has betrayed Siegfried, his love, his wife, which leads to his brutal murder by Hagen. And Hagen is an evil half-dwarf villain in the story. And so he is tricked and he is killed, murdered, the hero of the story. Brunhilde feels terribly about this and greatly just is despondent that she led to the death of her husband. So she said, you know what? I'm a daughter of Wotan, the god of the gods. I'm going to end the whole story here. So she says, she takes the ring that she gave to Siegfried, and she returns the ring to the Rhine maiden, who are the mermaids who guard the gold of the sacred mountain anyway. And she invokes the fire god Loga to come and destroy Valhalla. And so Valhalla is burned to flames and all the gods are destroyed. And then she lights a funeral pyre and jumps on it and returns to heaven to see Siegfried. Very powerful. And then at the very end, we there's this long, long chord, and the people return, and the era of the gods is over. So in Siegfried's Death and Funeral March, you starts with a funereal timpani on a very dissonant sort of note. And this represents the funeral of Siegfried, the great hero, the transcendent hero, who because of his selfless acts of heroism was able to set in motion the events that led to the conflagration of the great Valhalla, the Hall of the Gods, and led to the end of the wicked rule of the gods. And so the timpani announces the funeral, and during this time, his body is placed on his shield, and his body is taken away in a somber procession. So this is the funeral for Siegfried. So in the midst of this, you hear music of great pathos, of great grieving, and of great anger at what happened to the great hero. And then it builds and gets to this glorious trumpet solo that announces the best part of this work, which is the middle part, which is where everybody, instead of grieving, it turns to joy at the great life that this man lived, and everybody has sort of a memory of the heroic deeds that Siegfried did. And then the piece goes back to somber loneliness as his body is laid to rest. This is Siegfried's Death and Funeral March. when we rehearsed this first time about, how many, August, 6 weeks ago? 7 weeks ago? Yeah, and so we worked on this program and people were like, their eyes popped out of their heads, like, what? We're gonna play this? And I was telling them, this is the shortest concert we've ever done, in fact, in terms of the length of the pieces. But each piece feels like, it's like an emotional roller coaster, just like this epicness, right? So on Tuesday night, when we did a full run through of the concert, after the third piece, everybody was like, are we going home now? Like, what? We have 3 more pieces to go. It takes a lot of emotional resilience to understand what Wagner is after. This is the period of music history where composers are trying to elevate the genre. They're trying to bring you within their psychology and express something that's deep within their soul, and to be very individual, idiosyncratic, and a little bit wild. And that's what Wagner is. Well, we close this evening with the Prelude to Die Meistersinger. That is an opera that he wrote in the middle of writing the 15-hour Ring of the Nibelungen that took him 26 years. And in the middle, he's like, I'm going to write Tristan and Isolde and Die Meistersinger and this long opera. I don't know how he did it, but he was able to pull off some of the great operas of all time. What's interesting about Wagner, the only classical composer who wrote the words and the music to his operas. No one else did that. Some of them did it every once in a while. He's the only one. Sort of the person of today who did that is sort of like Stephen Sondheim, where you write the lyrics and you write the music. And that sort of gives a sense of cohesion and synthesis to the music that enhances its artistic power and its spiritual message. So Meistersinger is set in 16th century Nuremberg, Germany, where there's a guild of craftsmen and master singers who have a contest. And in the contest, people get to write a song and sing it, and whoever wins the contest gets to have as their bride, Eva, the gorgeous maiden. And so they have this contest, and there's 2 people that sort of vie for Eva's hand in marriage. One is a great singer, the other one is a lousy singer. And of course, the great singer Walter, he wins, and he wins the heart of Eva. So in the orchestral overture to Die Meistersinger, we have the beginning, which is the song and the theme of the Guild of Master Singers. It seems like some sort of retro ancient music from the past. Wagner never did this. This entire piece is in the key of C major, the most simple key, no sharps, no flats, and it sort of represents this ancient retro feel. And so we get the theme, this glorious, stately, courtly theme of the Guild of the Master Singers. And then we are brought to the love theme of Walter for Eva. Then we hear sort of the thunderous, royal applause sort of theme in the brass. I guess sort of royal fanfares. Then we encounter the love song that Walter wrote to win Eva's heart. And then it goes back to this regal music, and it builds up to this grandiose ending, tons of brass, which Wagner loves, and that's a great ending to our concert. Thanks for coming tonight. This is the Prelude to Die Meistersinger. Have a great night.